My pleasure is now to say hello from Berlin, first of all, and to move on to beautiful Canada, to the paradise of multiculturalism, as we all know. And I'm very happy to introduce to you Barbara Perry, who I think will give us quite a different perspective on this paradise, because she is the head of the director of the Center on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario University, and her expertise is precisely on this, on hate speech, on discrimination against minorities, and all this which threatens a tolerant society. So her perspective now will be from a country which is, or a nation which is maybe one of the most inclusive and most plural that we can imagine, to look at the dangers which even there can, hate speech and its consequences will present. And given the talk that we just heard, I think it's very important, because if I understood Kazmudik correctly, I think he said that hate speech is much more attractive and much more effective than the positive, nation building of the right wing populism. So I think it's very important to look at the aspect that Barbara now will be talking about. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction and for the invitation as well. It's great to be joining you from Canada. And it is the benefit, I think, of this new reality that we're in, that we can be more inclusive, I think, in our conferences, right? That, perhaps I wouldn't have been able to travel to Germany to join you. So it's nice to be able to see you virtually. And I am sorry to be bursting illusions that we all have about Canada. We certainly have our own problems, and what Cass was talking about, the far right, and that has certainly become a serious threat in the Canadian context as well. I want to go back to my bread and butter, though, today, and talk about hate crime specifically, and the way that it does, in fact, challenge the, sort of the belief in, and even the validity, I think, of the cult of multiculturalism in general, but specific to the Canadian context. So really what I'm going to share with you today are stories and the voices of people from affected communities that I've spoken to over the years in, a whole array of research projects, and really taking a deep dive, not so much at the individual impacts, but the community impacts and the broader social effects of hate crime. I'm going to make an attempt now to share my screen. Let's see how this goes. Are you seeing that? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so I am talking about the broader risks, broader harms associated with hate crime, really the risk to social solidarity and a sense of belonging that is disrupted by the persistence of hate crime. And just to set the foundation here, I just want to give a little background on some of the more recent data on hate crime. The most recent data we have is from 2018, so we'll talk a little bit more about what we expect to see after that. So presenting you here with two distinct definitions. One, on the one hand, obviously the one that law enforcement is meant to be using when they're exploring hate crime and investigating hate crime. And I mean, we have fairly weak hate crime legislation, I would say, in the Canadian context. We have some hate propaganda offenses, which are meant to contain hate speech and other expressions of animosity. Doesn't do a very good job because it's rarely prosecuted. And aside from that, we only have the sentencing enhancement legislation, which is what this is taken from, where there's a potential for increasing sentencing on a finding of guilt, where there is evidence that the offense was motivated by the factors that you see here. Actually, I need to update that because gender identity and expression are now included as of just last year. And again, the sentencing enhancement is rarely invoked. In fact, we don't really have a very solid idea of how often it is, because judges don't often or don't usually, in fact, state explicitly that they are invoking Section 718(2)A. And that's important, again, from a community perspective, if they are not seeing the legislation that exists enforced effectively in a way that is intended to protect them or intended to send a message about the impact and import of hate crime. On the other side, we have the definition that I developed, oh gosh, that's a long time ago now, in 2001, that, in some respects continues to drive the work and define the work that I do. And this really does speak to the broader social context and social implications of hate crime as some, a mechanism of power, a weapon of power intended to define or either reestablish or more firmly establish sort of the hierarchies that we have become far too accustomed to. So looking at the data, I think we've really only been reporting on the hate crime data for just over a decade now. So we don't have a long period of time here to really talk in comparative terms. But I think what is really dramatic is if you see here from 2016 to 2017, and Cass was sort of, eschewing the notion of Trumpism, but there was a Trump effect in the Canadian context in terms of the rise of the far right movement after the Trump election. And as you see here, a dramatic increase in hate crime from 2016 to 2017. That's a 47% increase. If we'd seen that in any other category of crime, we would have been calling for a national inquiry. There would have been gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands. There's a crisis. But this was met with quite dramatic silence. You see a slight decrease in 2018, but it's still higher than it had been historically. And we're already getting the sense for 2019, 2020, because of the increases of anti-Asian and anti-Semitic violence we're seeing in the context of COVID, it's quite likely we'll see another uptick for both of those years. We should be getting the 2019 data, I would think, fairly soon. Just in terms of what kinds of offenses we're looking at here, you can see, excuse me, that the bulk of the offenses are general mischief. So fairly low level of intensity there. But I think we shouldn't let that lull us into a sense of security. These offenses that are at the lower end, the mischief, the vandalism, the graffiti, all of those sorts of things, are, I think, by their very commonality, are problematic. And I think we know very well, for example, from the literature on violence against women, that these low-level assaults, these microaggressions, these mischiefs are seriously impactful for the targets. And again, not just individuals, but for the broader community. Mischief and vandalism, especially the second one, mischief in relation to property used primarily for worship or by an identifiable group, so a mosque or a synagogue or even a gay club, for that matter. These are incidents that really are the epitome of message crimes. They're not necessarily directed towards any particular individual, but to the community as a whole. So the mosque is defaced or somehow vandalized. The gay club is firebombed. Those are all incidents that are directed towards the broader community and really significant. Also, from the conversations that I've had with community members who have been targets of these lower levels, they themselves express the impact that has. Because it's relatively common. The slurs, if we look at maybe not uttering threats, but criminal harassment, for example, that language, that hateful language is such a common experience for them on the bus, on the streets, in the schools, that it is, sort of one person, a Native American in the US, in one of my earlier studies, talked about it as, sort of a water torture, drip, 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 drip. That wears you down over time. So I think we can't dismiss those lower level offenses. But then, after the general mischief, the next most frequent were uttering threats and common assault. So already jumping up in terms of level of intensity of those offenses. The distribution in terms of targeted communities or the motivation, probably no surprise here. I think it's fairly consistent across the West in particular, what the predominant, who the predominant targets are. So race and ethnicity tends to be the most common, followed by religion and sexual orientation as well. And specifically looking at race, anti-Black violence is the most common, and then other and Arab and West Asian, which is, if we look at especially the South Asian and the Arab and West Asian, I think complicates the picture in terms of religiously motivated violence as well. In that there is often an elision between race and religious identity when we're talking about a Muslim community in particular. So, some of those incidents that were recorded as, anti-Arab might in fact be anti-Muslim, or in fact that they are intersectional in that, both race and religion are the target. But we have no way in Canada of recording that, those dual motivations, which I think could be really telling and something that we've been lobbying for. So if we look at religion, again, as in so many countries, anti-Semitic violence tends to be the most common, followed by anti-Muslim violence. And you can see that increase in 2017 was largely accounted for by an increase in violence against the Muslim community. That was a 150% increase in reported incidents of anti-Muslim violence. So a really dramatic leap there. So that's just a little bit of background in terms of the lay of the land in Canada. Who the most frequent victims are, targets are of hate crime, and what kind of distribution we've seen. So I want to talk now, sort of get to the meat of the matter, and that is looking at the impacts of hate crime. And Agansky and others as well have looked at multiple layers and multiple levels of harm associated with hate crime. Obviously, harm to the initial victim. And we've got a pretty solid body of evidence now that suggests that the harms associated with bias-motivated crimes relative to their non-bias motivated counterparts are much more intense. That is, they are, the emotional impacts are felt more intensely. The psychological impacts, often the physical impacts are even greater. So if we look at anti-gay violence, for example, it's horrifically violent. Taking multiple blows with a tire iron or a boot, or strokes of a knife, as if to erase the identity of the victim. So even those physical harms are often more intense for the immediate victim. I think then, as I say, we've got a fairly well-established body of evidence there. Where we're just beginning to identify impacts is looking at the community effects. Harm to the victims group. So as I mentioned earlier on, we understand hate crime as a message crime, something that is intended not just to harm the immediate victim, but the distal victims as well. That is, it is a message to the broader community that they are not welcome, they're not valued, they're worthy of targeting. And so I think it's important that we recognize that. Harm to other targeted communities, very little scholarship in this area, and that is, sort of this notion of the ripple effect. So it's, if a mosque is attacked, does that then have implications, or does that then also send a message, or is it interpreted as a message by, say, the Jewish community? And I think we saw some of that, for example, when in the Christchurch attacks and the attack, 2 or 3 anti-Semitic attacks in the US, where in fact, that sort of provided a point of solidarity for Muslim and Jewish communities. And so I think there was that suggests that there is a recognition that, in this context, all religious minorities are vulnerable to attack. So I think that's something we need to look a little more closely at. What I've begun to see in some of the work that I've been doing on community impacts is not just this piece, harm to the victims community, but also the harm to societal norms and values, and exactly those threats to the validity or credibility of multiculturalism that we mentioned at the outset. And so that's also something that I want to share with you today. So what I'm going to share, as I mentioned, are the voices of community members that I've spoken to, and these are not necessarily, and this is important to note, that these are not necessarily people who have themselves been targeted, but are members of communities that are frequent targets of hate crime. So we're getting at those community impacts. So this first one is interesting. In that we presented a scenario that, sort of the specifics change depending on the community in question. So in this case, Jim was a gay male who was coming out of a gay club. In another one, we talked about, an attack on a Muslim person near a mosque, or a Jewish person near a synagogue, that sort of thing. So what we're looking for there is how they were responding to those attacks on people who were members of their community. And you can see here that real sense, that real notion of hate crime as a message crime, that if it happens to them, it can happen to me. That it is targeted at my community and not necessarily at any particular individual within that community. And that was something that came through fairly loud and clear across communities, right? That notion of risk that is posed to all members of the community. And the same with the second quote from an Asian person as well. Another sort of common theme that emerged, and I first started to see this way back when I was working with Native Americans in the U.S. when I was working and teaching there. That is that notion of normativity. That hate crime is such a constant in the lives and experiences of a whole array of communities that it comes to be seen as the first one suggests, sort of natural. It's always there, something always there. I remember one Indigenous person in the U.S. saying that they didn't really realize how oppressed they felt or how much they felt weighed down until they left their community and went somewhere else. And then there was just sort of an immediate lifting of the shoulders, if you will. So that notion of how insidious and how pervasive the risk and threat of hate crime is. And so, again, the first one says, I've lived so long as a gay man, it's just natural to not behave in certain ways, not to out yourself. So again, the natural notion of it. Second one talks about their shifts and changes, but hate crime can and always will be used as a tool to try and control, dominate, or oppress. So again, a notion of the immutability, if you will, of the problem. I think this notion of denial or disbelief in the Canadian context is especially salient, again, given our international reputation as being so inclusive and so committed to the ideals of multiculturalism. And that's what sort of takes people aback when they are targeted or when they see their community targeted. That is just, how can that happen? How can that happen in this country of all countries? Something I just don't understand, as someone says. Another one says, that it's very shocked that the appearance of homosexuality is such a cause for violent reaction from people. So, this sense of not understanding and not being able to comprehend that it could happen here. This one, the vulnerability and fear, is probably no surprise. I mean, this is from a perpetrator's perspective. This is the intent of hate crime, to instill a sense of vulnerability, to instill fear in those targeted communities. And so again, across identities, we find this repeated again and again, this notion that, yeah, in fact, it does make you more cautious, as the first one says. It makes you hypersensitive to anything, something similar to that happening to you. So it's sort of tying that notion of the message crime into that sense, heightened sense of vulnerability. It increases your anxiety and your fear. Makes you more cautious. So that notion of caution, right, and hypervigilance, and always sort of being, watching over your shoulder, comes through very strongly. And the pain, it makes me concerned, fearful for myself and for my family. And I think that fear and that vulnerability then connects to this next notion of enhancing the sense of inferiority or of oppression. I talked about that, that water torture, right? That drip, 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 and people often did use language that that invoked this notion of oppression, of being weighed down, of being pushed down. Some talked about, I feel like I get knocked down and I get back up and then I get knocked down, as a constant cycle in their lives. And so again, so this one says, the first one left me feeling lesser than the other person. They're direct attacks on my self-esteem and confidence. So wearing away at the sense of identity, at the sense of confidence and that individuals have in themselves relative to their identities. And the second one is very similar to that. You can't be who you are because there are things, the price that has to be paid for being who you are. So again, that notion of knowing one's place on the hierarchy. In addition to the emotional effects, there are also observable behavioral changes that are often evident in communities that are frequent targets. So the first one seems quite simple. That is, I don't leave my yard. If I go anywhere, I go on my bike, presumably so that they can move quite quickly and outrun anyone who might have any idea of attacking them. So it does change the way that people behave and move around in their worlds. This next one was from a Muslim person talking about women changing, and this was sort of in response to September 11th and the violence after September 11, but they say it persists. That is, some women being afraid, especially older women, to leave their homes by themselves and always wanting to be accompanied by someone who could protect them. A couple of the other things that we saw in this context, I don't think it comes up in the next one. Yeah, a little bit of, no, it is in the next one. Managing identities. This is sort of in that liminal space between, changing behavior and managing identities. Again, changing the way that one represents to the broader community. The sense that there's a need to somehow hide who they are, conceal who they are, as a means of defending themselves and protecting themselves from the potential of violence. And so I think the two communities where we see that the most is in the Muslim community and in the LGBTQ2 community. So there were, Muslim men who talked about, having to decide whether to retain a beard or not, or to dress in traditional garb, and with women in particular, questioning whether it was safe, whether it was necessary for them to think again about whether they would be covered in any way, whether that was hijab or niqab. And so that was something that was pretty consistent in conversation. Is pretty consistent in conversations with Muslims. Again, having to question their representation of self. And same with the LGBTQ community. And this one says, maybe I should look less gay, whatever that means, in a North American context in particular. And for many, that meant, this is a very long one. I apologize for that, but it's a really pithy one. So a lot of LGBTQ people talked about, sort of feeling like in some context, they sort of had to go back in the closet. They were very careful about who they revealed their identity to, who they revealed their sexual orientation to. Some talked about, having been out, fully out at one point, and then sort of closing the door a little bit in the context of, violence occurring around them, or, highly publicized cases of anti-LGBTQ violence. So this one, as I said, quite a lengthy one, but I think captures a number of those threads that I was talking about earlier on. Again, it's unconscious. It's become so natural that decision becomes unconscious. I don't think I consciously chose to. It's just easier. And then these things could easily happen to me. It beats you down a little bit. So that notion of oppression. And then the result of that is maybe I should conceal more. And again, I'm not sure that I'm sure that plays subconsciously, again, that normativity, not being as open when you know that the threat is there. So, again, forcing people to change their way of being. So I want to shift gears a little bit here to look at more that last point that I raised in terms of the harms, and that is the threat that is posed to those core Canadian values for which we're so famous, equity and inclusion and respect for diversity. And I think there were a number of indications that, and wasn't necessarily something I was going looking for. So interesting that these came up sort of organically, indications that, that hate crime does whittle away at those values. So the first one is about lack of protection. And, to preface this by talking perhaps a little bit about, the reporting and underreporting of hate crime is probably the most underreported category of crime. Probably no more than 25% of all cases of hate crime are actually reported to police. And part of that is because of the fear or the concern that it won't be taken seriously. That not only is there a history of over-policing some of these communities, but there's also a history of under-policing these communities that is not providing the protections that are warranted. And some are even fearful of, sort of secondary victimization at the hands of law enforcement, either, some form of verbal harassment or even physical violence. So there is a sense of that lack of protection. And I think that is magnified when you think about how rarely the sentencing enhancement provision, for example, is invoked, or how rarely there are successful prosecutions of hate propaganda or hate speech. So all of these, I think, come together to create a sense of not being subject to the same level of protection. The second one, I think, in particular, speaks to that question of whether law enforcement take it seriously, whether in fact hate crime is subsequently prosecuted. So even if they were arrested, they probably avoided being convicted and sentenced for the hate aspect, as the current legislation makes it too difficult to prove. And it absolutely is. The standard, the bar is so high. So both police and the courts are perceived to be letting folks down in that respect. Again, this notion of divisiveness and the role that hate crime plays in that, and as the first one suggests, leading to the deterioration of relationships between communities, whether that is the Muslim and Christian community, or Black, white, or even there are some small proportion of cases that are sort of minority on minority, if you will, intersectional in a very different respect. That is anti-Semitic violence perpetrated by Black people, regardless, right? Regardless of who the perpetrator and the victim communities are, it has that capacity to whittle away at the relationships there, or just to staunch any forward momentum in healing those relationships. And the second one, very similar, creates separation, hatred, and rivalry. As many may want to seek revenge. And we did see, we have seen some cases of that sort of retaliatory violence, almost cycles of violence between communities. I really saw that in the Southwest. I think someone needs to mute there. Yeah, sorry.
On digital humanities and sowas, was ganz
so I saw that in the Southwest when I was working in Arizona, and the first community I worked with was the Navajo community there, and found that there was a lot of sort of back and forth violence between the Latino and the Navajo community in that area, and it was this sort of revenge violence that just cycled on and on and on. So that's a real strong possibility. Lack of belonging, again, one of the sentiments that emerged quite regularly across communities. That just what it says on the tin, right? That sense that hate crime is intended to and has the effect of making people feel like they are not welcome, they don't belong, they're not included in the broader community. So the first one is very explicit. We're made to feel inferior and like we don't belong, like we're unwelcomed. Non-Muslims see Muslims as aliens and community people to blame and their frustrations take their frustrations out on. We're alienated, not free to practice our religion. So again, that notion of this one also, the second one also speaks to the notion of having to sort of tamp down their identity. Hide or conceal that in order to have a harmonious relationship wherever they might be, just to be respected. So again, that risk, that threat of hate crime is a reminder, right? That constant reminder that they are ever outsiders in the Canadian context. Which then is sort of the flip side of that, the obverse of that is this notion that then they begin to question Canadian inclusivity. Again, one of those key values that often draws people to our country. It comes back to one of the first points that I was making. The hurt is strong, as in Canada, we're supposed to live in a society without a fear of attack. So again, that disbelief that it happens here. A sadness for the state of the community where people feel it's appropriate to harass someone because of their orientation. I mean, this is Canada, right? So again, really highlighting that notion of feeling that in fact not everyone is included, not everyone is considered to be part of the collective. There are silver linings to all of this. I mean, I've really highlighted, and because these are the most common, that is the negative impacts of hate crime. Absolutely, the impacts that are intended by the perpetrator to marginalize people, to disempower them, to silence them in some way. But I sort of found the obverse in many contexts as well. That is a sense that, especially if there were, either a particularly highly publicized or heinous incident, or in some communities where there seemed to have been, quite a rash of violence against particular communities in a short period of time. Or as in the case of the 2017 data, where we've seen a dramatic increase in the data. And that is that people mobilized, people sort of became empowered rather than disempowered, refused to be silenced by the perpetrator's actions. And I think that was really exciting to see. And one of the places where I'll give you two examples where I saw that really, sort of at the highest level. One was when I was doing work with Ojibwe, in particular Ojibwe communities in Minnesota and Wisconsin around the Great Lakes. And this was, I mean, I was doing these interviews in the 2000s, but people's memories of these events in the early 1990s were so clear, and it was so clear how it changed their sense of solidarity. So that was a period of time when Ojibwe began to exercise their traditional treaty rights to fish, spearfishing in the lakes in the spring, and the sport fishers and the professional fishers were up in arms because they thought that that would result in overfishing, that the indigenous communities would overfish the waters and leave nothing for them, when in fact they took something like 5 or 10% of the catch in any given year. And so there was, for 4 or 5 years running, horrific violence at the boat launches when, in the evenings when folks would go out to start their fishing. There were fire bombs, there were bottle rockets, that is big firecrackers being thrown at people. There were, tires being loosened on vehicles, people being burnt with cigarettes. Just touch wood that there were no murders, but there were some really serious injuries associated with that. Rather than that stalling the fishing, it actually brought more people back to the community. So people who had no relationship with those who were fishing, came to the boat launches to defend their treaty rights. People who had left the community, and gone elsewhere across the US or even into Canada, came back to the community to stand in solidarity with their brothers and sisters. So it actually led to a resurgence of connection to their identity rather than silencing them. So a different case, a smaller scale case in my own community just a few years back, where a lesbian couple were attacked by a male at the schoolyard, the parking lot of the school, when they went to pick up their children from school. And so, the fact that they were assaulted verbally and physically was bad enough, but the fact that they did it at the school, where not only did their kids see it, but other kids saw it as well, really created a dramatic backlash in the community and across the area, the region, not just in the LGBTQ community, but it certainly galvanized the queer community in our area, and I think led to a long-term growth in the organizing capacity of that community. So again, the opposite to what was expected there. And again, these quotes here really highlight that is a fairly consistent, fairly common reaction across communities. That is the tendency to get to sort of like that old movie. What was it? Gone now. It was about the newspaper industry, and where he said, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." And you sort of saw that sentiment coming out amongst a number of people. So yeah, in my Pollyannish way, in my rose-colored glasses way, this is a quote that I love to use to end this conversation. I'd like to see all of humanity to hold hands, unite, and love and respect one another, as we're all human at the end of the day. This is done by simply demonstrating to people that we all cry, feel, bleed, and sleep. We are all weak. We are all equal. And I think there's no better time, at least in North America, to remind ourselves of that message. So that is me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this very impressive talk. And I think, at least for me, the image of the water torture of low-level aggressions on a constant level was very, it will stay with us for sure. I do have already the first question by Maria Alexopoulos, and please, Maria.
Yes, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I hope you hear me. Yeah. Could you suggest any methodological tools how to measure these impacts of the particular events that had any impact on the communities? How do I measure this? particularly in a historical perspective, where the only tool I have is oral history or any events, and maybe I don't have partners to speak with, or how do I measure the impact on all those levels? You this was one question. Maybe the answer could be if these impacts, or if you think that these impacts you described can be generalized. Is it a kind of generalization that we can make here? And another small question I have is if you consider microaggressions also as hate crimes.
Thank you.
I'll answer the last one first. Actually, I do. I think about it as a continuum. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Jennifer Schwepp, and I just have completed a paper and submitted a paper on exactly that. Right? What is the milieu of hate studies? Do microaggressions fit in there? And for me, I mean, hate crime is not just about the legal category, right? It is about those harms, and those are some of the things that are, again, at that lower level of the continuum that have sometimes the greatest impact. So yeah, I would absolutely include them. In terms of measuring those impacts, it's a real challenge to do it, sort of quantitatively, in particular, because I mean, I've actually reviewed a few papers that are based on the UCR crime data, hate crime data in the U.S., for example, and then sort of looked at the patterns in things like moving, relocating from affected communities, or those sorts of more behavioral indicators. And I mean, I always say they're fatally flawed because they're grounded in the UCR data, which are so limited. I mean, there are states like Mississippi that don't report any hate crime. And I think that's probably not true. So for me, I think, the qualitative approach, I mean, you could probably do a survey, after an incident. There have been a couple of studies, around the Matthew Shepard case, for example. More qualitative, I think. What were the short-term and long-term impacts of his murder, and it wasn't just about the murder itself, right? It was on the justice processing of that as well. I'm trying to think if I'm aware. I'm not aware that there have been any similar projects around, say, the Christchurch attacks, or even the Canadian context, the mosque murders in Quebec City a few years back. But I think that is the sort of the time to launch the research, right? Is in the immediate aftermath. It's hard for communities to have those conversations sometimes, but I also find people have talked about being given this voice, right, through the research, given this opportunity to share the story, is a positive thing. I wouldn't say cathartic necessarily, but in some respects therapeutic, right? Talking it through. So I mean, that is one way. I think the qualitative approach, interviews with affected communities. And what I think is interesting with those kinds of cases is that it's really shows the community impacts. Because if we were to do a study after the Christchurch attacks in Australia, in the US, in Germany, we'd probably see the same reactions. So it really does speak to, I think, the extent of how broadly those effects travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
And generalizations. I think the generalizations question is, I mean, my projects have been relatively large for qualitative research, hundreds of interviews in most of them. And I think the fact that we're seeing the same trends across communities speaks to maybe the underlying validity of those themes that emerge.
Yeah.
Thank you
I
very
think
much.
as an historian, maybe this is the path I can take, to take this as a general pattern, also for my work, where I don't make a survey at the community at that point.
Yeah. Okay, something 70 years ago, right?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I mean, one way is is media, tracking through the media, right? What's the media representation? Are there letters to the editor? That sort of thing. I've done that at a small scale, as an indicator. So yeah, it's obviously archival work of all sorts there, but yeah, and becomes easier. I mean, 100 years ago, whose voices, did we hear? They were certainly not the voices of the powerless and the targeted. So yeah.
So I feel it's getting, as a chair, it's my first time chairing an online conference, and it's much harder to separate an ongoing discussion between two people than when you can do it in person with your body language. So I'm trying to do it now just by talking. I mean, we are already a little bit over time, but if there's another urgent question, it can be posed now. If not, I would copy Matthias Gwent and ask you to pose it by chat in the chat version, so that we can now have a coffee break together or separately as we like, and we reunite here and resume the conference at 3:50, 10 minutes before. So thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you for the question, Maria, and see you in half an hour.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.